The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the grand corridors. At 8 years old, she carried herself with the poise expected of a royal, but today something felt different. The usual warmth that filled these halls seemed cold and distant. Charlotte had always been close to her grandmother, Queen Camilla. Ever since she was little, Camilla would spend hours reading her stories, teaching her about flowers in the palace gardens, and sharing quiet moments that made Charlotte feel special and loved. But, lately, things had changed in ways that confused and frightened the young princess. It started 3 weeks ago during a family dinner. Charlotte noticed how Camilla's hands shook slightly when she reached for her teacup. At first, she thought maybe her grandmother was just tired from her royal duties. The Queen had been working harder than usual, attending more events and meetings than ever before. But then came the moments that made Charlotte's heart ache. She would find Camilla standing in empty rooms, staring out windows with tears in her eyes. Sometimes, the Queen would forget where she placed things or seem confused about what day it was. These episodes were brief, but they scared Charlotte more than any thunderstorm ever could. The palace staff had noticed too, though they tried to hide their concerns. Charlotte overheard whispered conversations between the housekeepers and saw the worried looks that passed between the royal doctors when they thought no one was watching. Something was wrong with Camilla, and everyone seemed to know except Charlotte herself. Yesterday evening had been the breaking point. Charlotte went to find Camilla in her private sitting room, hoping to share news about her art class at school. She found her grandmother sitting in her favorite chair, but Camilla looked right through her as if she wasn't even there. When Charlotte called out, Camilla seemed startled and asked who she was. The confusion only lasted a few seconds before recognition returned to Camilla's eyes, but those moments felt like forever to Charlotte. Her grandmother quickly covered up the incident, claiming she was just daydreaming, but Charlotte knew something deeper was happening. That night, Charlotte lay in her bed unable to sleep. She heard her parents, Prince William and Catherine, talking in hushed voices down the hallway. Though she couldn't make out all the words, she caught fragments that made her stomach twist with worry. Words like specialist, treatment, and how do we tell the children drifted through the silence. This morning brought no relief. At breakfast, Charlotte watched carefully as Camilla struggled to butter her toast, her hands trembling more than usual. When Camilla dropped her knife with a loud clatter, she looked around the table with embarrassment and fear in her eyes. Charlotte's father quickly helped pick up the utensil, making light conversation to ease the tension, but Charlotte saw through the forced cheerfulness. Her younger brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of worry that filled the dining room. After breakfast, Charlotte decided she needed to understand what was happening. She had always been mature for her age, and she couldn't bear not knowing why her beloved grandmother seemed to be slipping away from them. The not knowing felt worse than any truth could be. She made her way to the library, where she had often found comfort among the thousands of books that lined the walls. But, today, the familiar space felt overwhelming. Charlotte pulled down a medical encyclopedia, hoping to find answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask properly. As she flipped through pages about various illnesses and conditions, Charlotte felt more confused than ever. The medical terms were too complex, and the descriptions too clinical to relate to what she was seeing in her grandmother. She needed to talk to someone who would give her honest answers. Charlotte thought about approaching her parents, but she had seen how hard they were trying to protect her and her brothers from whatever was happening. She considered talking to her private secretary or one of the palace staff members she trusted, but something held her back. Instead, she decided to spend more time with Camilla herself. Maybe if she watched carefully and listened closely, she could understand what was happening without having to ask difficult questions that might upset everyone further. Charlotte made her way to Camilla's private apartments, where she knew her grandmother spent most of her quiet time. The hallway leading to these rooms had always felt special to Charlotte. The walls were lined with family portraits and personal photographs that told the story of their family's history. As she approached Camilla's sitting room, Charlotte heard her grandmother's voice coming from behind the partially closed door. But something about the tone made her pause before entering. Camilla sounded distressed, almost desperate in a way Charlotte had never heard before. Through the gap in the door, Charlotte could see Camilla sitting at her writing desk, holding what appeared to be a letter. Her grandmother's voice was barely above a whisper, but, in the quiet of the hallway, Charlotte could hear every word clearly. Camilla was talking to herself, or perhaps to someone who wasn't there. She spoke about feeling lost and confused, about moments when familiar faces seemed like strangers, and about the terror of losing pieces of herself bit by bit. Charlotte's young heart broke as she listened to her grandmother's private anguish. This was the explanation she had been seeking, but hearing it made everything so much more real and frightening than she had imagined. The letter in Camilla's hands appeared to be something she had been trying to write, perhaps to explain her condition to the family or to document her thoughts while she still could. Charlotte watched as Camilla struggled to find the right words, starting sentences only to cross them out moments later. As Charlotte stood frozen in the hallway, she realized she was witnessing something deeply private and painful. Part of her wanted to run away and pretend she hadn't seen or heard anything. Another part wanted to rush in and comfort her grandmother, to tell her that nothing would change how much she loved her. But Charlotte did neither. Instead, she remained perfectly still, understanding instinctively that this was a moment that would change everything for their family. The innocence of childhood was slipping away as she faced the reality that people she loved could become ill in ways that medicine couldn't always fix. Camilla's voice grew more agitated as she continued speaking to herself. She expressed frustration about forgetting important events and worrying that she might say or do something that would embarrass the royal family. The weight of her responsibilities seemed to crush down on her as she struggled with her changing mind. Charlotte felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. This wasn't the strong, confident queen she had always known. This was a scared, vulnerable woman who was fighting a battle that no one could fight for her. The sound of footsteps approaching from the other end of the hallway made Charlotte realize she needed to move. She couldn't be caught eavesdropping on such a private moment, but she also couldn't simply walk away as if nothing had happened. As the footsteps grew closer, Charlotte recognized them as belonging to one of the royal protection officers. She quickly but quietly moved away from Camilla's door, her mind racing with everything she had just witnessed. The walk back to her own rooms felt like the longest journey of Charlotte's young life. Every step carried the weight of new knowledge that she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. But there was no going back now. She had seen behind the careful facade that the adults had constructed to protect her. Charlotte realized that her relationship with her grandmother was about to change in ways she couldn't fully understand yet. But one thing was certain, her love for Camilla would remain constant, no matter what challenges lay ahead for their family. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Kensington Palace. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, one of Britain's leading neurologists, arrived discreetly through a side entrance, away from the watchful eyes of the media that constantly monitored the royal family's activities. Charlotte didn't know about the doctor's visit initially. She was in her morning tutoring session, struggling to concentrate on mathematics while her thoughts remained fixed on what she had overheard the previous day. Her tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed her distraction but attributed it to the usual challenges of keeping an 8-year-old focused on academic work. It was during her break between lessons that Charlotte noticed the unusual activity in the palace. Extra security personnel had been positioned throughout the corridors, and several staff members were speaking in hushed tones near Camilla's private quarters. The atmosphere felt charged with nervous energy that made Charlotte's stomach clench with worry. She decided to investigate, using the network of service corridors that she had explored during countless games of hide and seek with her brothers. These narrow passageways, originally designed for servants to move through the palace unseen, had become Charlotte's secret highways for observing the adult world without being detected. Through a small ventilation grate, Charlotte could see into one of the palace's private medical rooms. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw Camilla sitting on an examination table, looking smaller and more fragile than Charlotte had ever seen her. Dr. Thornfield was conducting what appeared to be a series of cognitive tests, asking Camilla to remember lists of words and perform simple mental exercises. Charlotte watched in growing distress as her grandmother struggled with tasks that should have been easy. Camilla's frustration was evident in every gesture, and Charlotte could see tears of embarrassment forming in her eyes when she couldn't recall information that had been presented just minutes earlier. The test continued for what felt like hours to Charlotte, though it was probably only 30 minutes. She watched Dr. Thornfield make careful notes while Camilla answered questions about her daily routine, recent memory lapses, and changes in her ability to perform familiar tasks. When Camilla was asked about her family, Charlotte felt a spark of hope. Surely her grandmother would excel at this part of the examination. Camilla spoke lovingly about her stepchildren and grandchildren, describing Charlotte and her brothers with warm detail that brought relief to the hidden observer. But then, Dr. Thornfield asked about more recent interactions, and Charlotte's hope began to fade. Camilla struggled to remember conversations from the previous week and seemed confused about which events had happened when. The woman who had once managed complex royal schedules with ease was now having difficulty organizing simple sequences of recent events. After the examination, Charlotte remained hidden as Dr. Thornfield met privately with her parents in an adjacent room. Though she couldn't hear the specific medical terms being discussed, the gravity in the doctor's voice was unmistakable. This was not a minor issue that would resolve with rest or medication. Charlotte's father asked direct questions about treatment options and progression, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was trying to understand how to help while preparing for the worst possible outcomes. Her mother's questions focused more on how to support Camilla emotionally and maintain her dignity throughout whatever lay ahead. The conversation that followed revealed details that shattered Charlotte's remaining hope that this might be a temporary problem. Dr. Thornfield spoke about early-stage dementia, explaining how the condition would likely progress and what the family could expect in the coming months and years. Charlotte had to cover her mouth to prevent herself from crying out loud when she heard the doctor explain that Camilla's symptoms would gradually worsen, affecting her memory, judgment, and eventually her ability to recognize loved ones. The disease would slowly steal away the grandmother Charlotte knew and loved, leaving behind someone who looked the same but was fundamentally changed. The discussion turned to practical matters that Charlotte had never considered. How would they modify Camilla's royal duties to accommodate her changing abilities? How would they maintain security while ensuring she received proper care? How would they prepare the public for the eventual revelation of her condition? Most importantly for Charlotte, how would they tell the royal children what was happening to their grandmother? The adults debated the timing and approach for this conversation, weighing the benefits of honesty against the desire to protect the children from harsh realities for as long as possible. Charlotte listened as her parents struggled with decisions that had no perfect solutions. They wanted to involve Camilla in choosing how much to share with the grandchildren, but they also recognized that her ability to make such complex decisions might be compromised by the very condition they were trying to address. As the meeting concluded, Charlotte realized she needed to return to her lessons before her absence was noticed. She made her way back through the service corridors, her mind reeling with everything she had learned. The medical terminology was largely beyond her understanding, but the emotional reality was devastatingly clear. Her afternoon art lesson provided no escape from her troubled thoughts. Charlotte found herself drawing pictures of her grandmother, trying to capture the Camilla she remembered from happier times. Her art teacher praised her work but noticed the sadness in the images, asking gentle questions that Charlotte deflected with practiced royal diplomacy. That evening at dinner, Charlotte watched her family with new eyes. Everyone was trying so hard to maintain normalcy, but she could see the strain beneath their cheerful conversations. Her father made extra effort to engage Camilla in discussion about her day, while her mother ensured that Camilla's favorite foods were served and that she felt included in all family conversations. George and Louis seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of worry that surrounded them, chattering excitedly about their school activities and upcoming events. Charlotte envied their innocence while simultaneously wanting to protect it for as long as possible. After dinner, Charlotte made an excuse to visit Camilla's apartments. She found her grandmother sitting in her favorite chair, looking through photo albums filled with family memories. Camilla's face lit up when she saw Charlotte, and, for a moment, everything felt normal again. They spent an hour looking at pictures together, with Camilla sharing stories about Charlotte's father's childhood and the early days of her marriage to King Charles. Charlotte treasured every word, knowing now that these memories might not always be accessible to her grandmother. As they talked, Charlotte noticed subtle signs of the condition she had learned about that day. Camilla repeated certain stories and sometimes seemed uncertain about when specific photos had been taken. But her love for the family shone through every confused moment, reminding Charlotte that the most important parts of her grandmother remained intact. When it was time for Charlotte to return to her own rooms for the night, Camilla hugged her extra tightly. "You know I love you very much, don't you, darling?" Camilla whispered, and Charlotte heard something in her voice that suggested her grandmother might be more aware of her condition than the adults realized. Charlotte nodded against her grandmother's shoulder, fighting back tears. "I love you too, Granny. No matter what." That night, Charlotte lay in bed processing everything she had learned. She understood now why the adults were being so careful about what they shared. The truth was overwhelming even for her, and she was more mature than most children her age. But Charlotte also felt a growing determination. She might not be able to stop what was happening to Camilla, but she could choose how she responded to it. She could be brave and loving, providing comfort and joy during whatever time they had left together. As sleep finally came, Charlotte made a silent promise to herself and to her grandmother. She would treasure every moment, create beautiful memories whenever possible, and love Camilla completely regardless of what changes the disease might bring to their relationship. 2 weeks after Dr. Thornfield's visit, Charlotte's carefully constructed world of secrets began to crumble in ways she never anticipated. The family had settled into what felt like a new normal, with everyone working harder to create positive moments with Camilla while privately preparing for an uncertain future. Charlotte had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of her grandmother's condition. She noticed when Camilla needed a moment longer to process information, when familiar names seemed to escape her briefly, or when she became frustrated by tasks that once came naturally. But she also celebrated the good days when Camilla seemed completely herself, engaging in complex conversations and remembering details that surprised everyone. The morning started like many others, with Charlotte joining her grandmother for their traditional tea time in the palace's conservatory. This had become Charlotte's favorite part of the day, a peaceful hour among the flowers where they could talk about anything or simply enjoy comfortable silence together. Camilla was having a particularly good day, sharing stories about her upcoming engagements and asking detailed questions about Charlotte's schoolwork. They laughed together about Charlotte's latest art project, a somewhat lopsided portrait of the family dog that had captured the animal's personality if not his exact proportions. But, as they talked, Charlotte began to notice something that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Camilla kept mentioning someone named Diana, speaking about her as if she were a close friend who was expected to join them for tea at any moment. At first, Charlotte thought her grandmother might be confused about which day it was or perhaps thinking about a different social gathering. But, as the conversation continued, it became clear that Camilla believed Princess Diana, Charlotte's late grandmother whom she had never met, was alive and actively involved in current family activities. Charlotte felt her chest tighten with anxiety as she realized this was different from the minor confusion and memory lapses she had observed before. This was a complete departure from reality, and she had no idea how to respond without either lying to her grandmother or causing her distress. Camilla spoke warmly about Diana's supposed opinions on Charlotte's education, her imagined advice about royal protocol, and plans they had allegedly made together for upcoming family events. To Camilla, these conversations and shared experiences felt completely real and current. Charlotte tried gently redirecting the conversation, but every topic seemed to lead back to Diana in Camilla's mind. When Charlotte mentioned her father, Camilla spoke about how proud Diana must be of William's accomplishments. When Charlotte talked about her mother Catherine, Camilla wondered aloud what Diana thought of her son's choice in a wife. The situation became more distressing when Camilla began expressing concern that Diana was late for their tea appointment. She checked her watch repeatedly and looked toward the conservatory entrance with growing worry, wondering if something had happened to prevent Diana from joining them. Charlotte excused herself to use the bathroom, but instead rushed to find her mother. She found Catherine in the morning room, reviewing correspondence with her private secretary. Charlotte's obvious distress immediately captured her mother's full attention. "Mom, something's wrong with Granny," Charlotte whispered urgently, not wanting to discuss family matters in front of staff members. "She keeps talking about Diana like she's coming to tea today. She thinks they're friends and that Diana is still alive." Catherine's face went pale as she absorbed this information. She quickly dismissed her secretary and knelt down to Charlotte's level, taking her hands gently but firmly. "Charlotte, I need you to listen very carefully," Catherine said in the calm but serious tone she used during important conversations. Granny is having what the doctors call an episode. Her mind is mixing up memories from different times, and she truly believes what she's saying right now. Charlotte nodded, trying to understand. Should I tell her that Diana isn't really coming? Should I remind her that Diana died before I was born? Catherine shook her head sadly. No, darling. When someone with Granny's condition has episodes like this, correcting them usually makes them more confused and upset. It's kinder to go along with what they're experiencing, as long as it's not harmful. This advice felt wrong to Charlotte, who had always been taught that honesty was important in their family. But she trusted her mother's judgment and understood that this was an exception to normal rules because of Camilla's illness. Catherine accompanied Charlotte back to the conservatory, where they found Camilla becoming increasingly agitated about Diana's absence. She was now convinced that something terrible must have happened to prevent Diana from keeping their appointment. Catherine handled the situation with grace that Charlotte admired and wanted to learn from. She suggested that Diana had probably been delayed by traffic or an unexpected royal duty, and assured Camilla that they would reschedule their tea for another day. Camilla accepted this explanation with visible relief. As they talked, Charlotte watched her mother navigate the delicate balance between providing comfort and avoiding elaborate deceptions. Catherine acknowledged Camilla's feelings without reinforcing the false memories, redirecting conversations when necessary while maintaining warmth and respect throughout the interaction. The episode lasted about an hour before Camilla gradually returned to present-day awareness. The transition was subtle, like watching someone wake up slowly from a vivid dream. Camilla seemed to realize that something had been different about her thinking, though she didn't explicitly acknowledge what had happened. After Camilla retired to her rooms for a rest, Catherine sat with Charlotte to process what they had experienced together. Charlotte had dozens of questions about how often these episodes might occur, whether they would get worse, and how she should respond if she were alone with Camilla during future incidents. Catherine explained that episodes like this might become more frequent as Camilla's condition progressed. She taught Charlotte practical strategies for responding with kindness while protecting both herself and her grandmother from unnecessary distress. They also discussed the emotional challenges that Charlotte would face as she witnessed more changes in her beloved grandmother. Catherine emphasized that loving someone with dementia required flexibility and patience, and that it was normal to feel sad, confused, or even angry about the unfairness of the situation. That afternoon, Charlotte's brothers returned from their own activities, full of energy and excitement about their day. Charlotte felt the weight of her additional knowledge as she watched them interact normally with Camilla, who seemed completely herself again during their family time together. George and Louis had no idea how close they had come to witnessing their grandmother in a state of confusion that would have frightened and puzzled them. Charlotte wondered how much longer the family could maintain this protective bubble around her younger brothers. During dinner, Charlotte paid careful attention to how her father interacted with Camilla. She noticed that he had developed subtle ways of supporting her without drawing attention to her difficulties. He would gently repeat information if she seemed confused, help her find words when she struggled, and create structure in conversations that helped her participate more easily. Charlotte began to understand that caring for someone with dementia was like learning a new language of love and support. Every family member would need to develop these skills to help Camilla maintain her dignity while feeling safe and valued. That evening, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she reflected on how much her understanding of her grandmother's condition had deepened in just one day. The clinical description she had overheard from Dr. Thornfield now had real, emotional meaning that made the disease feel more immediate and challenging. But Charlotte also felt proud of how she had handled her first real crisis related to Camilla's condition. She had stayed calm, sought help when needed, and supported both her grandmother and mother through a difficult situation. These small victories would become important building blocks for the journey ahead. Before falling asleep, Charlotte made a mental note to ask her parents more questions about what to expect and how she could best help. She was no longer content to be protected from the reality of Camilla's illness. She wanted to be part of the solution, contributing to her grandmother's care in age-appropriate but meaningful ways. 3 months had passed since Charlotte first discovered the truth about her grandmother's condition, and the palace had gradually adapted to new routines designed to support Camilla while maintaining the dignity befitting her royal position. However, nothing could have prepared Charlotte for the events that would unfold on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. Charlotte had just finished her piano lesson and was walking through the grand corridor when she heard raised voices coming from Camilla's private study. This was unusual because Camilla's afternoon schedule was typically kept light and calm, with only her most trusted staff members having access during these hours. As Charlotte approached, she could distinguish her grandmother's voice, but it carried a tone of distress and confusion that immediately put Charlotte on high alert. The other voice belonged to Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, Camilla's longtime personal assistant, who sounded equally upset but for different reasons. Charlotte positioned herself near the partially open door, her heart racing as she tried to understand what was happening. Through the gap, she could see Camilla standing near her desk, holding what appeared to be several official documents. Her hands were trembling, and her face showed the kind of anguished confusion that Charlotte had learned to recognize as signs of a particularly difficult episode. Mrs. Whitmore was trying to gently persuade Camilla to sit down, speaking in the patient but firm tone that the staff had been trained to use during these situations. But Camilla was becoming increasingly agitated, insisting that she needed to complete urgent royal duties that existed only in her confused mind. "The state dinner is tonight, Patricia," Camilla said with growing frustration. "The Prime Minister will be here any moment, and I haven't finished reviewing the guest list. Why hasn't anyone told me about the changes to the menu? This is completely unacceptable." Charlotte's stomach dropped as she realized her grandmother was experiencing a severe episode of confusion. There was no state dinner planned, the Prime Minister was not expected, and the documents Camilla was clutching were months-old correspondence that had already been addressed. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to redirect Camilla's attention. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could review those documents after you've had some tea. You've been working so hard today, and I'm sure a brief rest would help you think more clearly." But Camilla was beyond reasoning. Her confusion had triggered anxiety that was escalating rapidly. "I don't need rest, I need answers. Where is everyone? Where is my husband? Why has no one prepared me properly for tonight's event? This is a disaster." Charlotte watched in growing alarm as her grandmother became more upset. Camilla was now pacing the small space of her study, holding the irrelevant documents like precious artifacts while making increasingly impossible demands about imaginary responsibilities. The situation worsened when Camilla noticed Charlotte through the partially open door. But, instead of recognizing her beloved granddaughter, Camilla's expression showed only confusion and mild suspicion. "Who is that child?" Camilla asked Mrs. Whitmore sharply. "Why is she standing there? This is a private meeting about sensitive royal matters. She shouldn't be here." Charlotte felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Her grandmother, the woman who had read her bedtime stories and taught her about flowers in the palace gardens, was looking at her as if she were a complete stranger. The recognition that usually lit up Camilla's face when she saw Charlotte was completely absent. Mrs. Whitmore quickly moved to manage the situation. "Your Majesty, that's Princess Charlotte. Perhaps she came to see if you'd like to join her for afternoon tea." Camilla's expression remained skeptical. "I don't know any Princess Charlotte. And I certainly don't have time for tea when there's so much work to be done for tonight's dinner." She returned her attention to the meaningless documents, studying them with intense concentration that revealed nothing but her profound confusion. Charlotte felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to remain quiet and still. She remembered her mother's advice about not correcting Camilla during episodes, but being completely forgotten by someone she loved so deeply was more painful than anything she had imagined. Mrs. Whitmore caught Charlotte's eye and made a subtle gesture indicating that Charlotte should leave. But Charlotte found herself frozen, unable to walk away from her grandmother's distress even though her presence seemed to be adding to Camilla's confusion. The episode continued for another agonizing 20 minutes. Camilla became increasingly upset about the fictional state dinner, demanding to speak with staff members who weren't on duty and insisting on reviewing preparations for events that existed only in her confused mind. Every attempt by Mrs. Whitmore to provide gentle reality orientation only increased Camilla's agitation. Finally, Charlotte heard the approaching footsteps that indicated reinforcements were arriving. Her father and Dr. Thornfield appeared in the corridor, having been summoned by palace staff who recognized that professional intervention was needed. Prince William took in the scene quickly, his face showing the strain of seeing his stepmother in such distress. He entered the study with calm confidence, speaking to Camilla in warm, reassuring tones that gradually began to penetrate her confusion. "Camilla, you look tired," he said gently, approaching slowly to avoid startling her further. "Why don't we sit down together and go through these important documents? I can help you make sure everything is properly organized." Dr. Thornfield remained in the background, observing Camilla's responses and taking notes that would help guide future care decisions. Charlotte watched as the medical professional assessed the severity of the episode while respecting the family's need to handle the immediate crisis with love rather than clinical intervention. Gradually, through patient conversation and careful emotional support, Prince William was able to help Camilla transition away from her acute confusion. The process took nearly an hour, during which Charlotte remained hidden in the corridor, witnessing every moment of her grandmother's struggle to reconnect with reality. The most heartbreaking moment came when Camilla's awareness returned enough for her to recognize William, but not enough to understand what had happened to her. She looked around the study with confusion, noting the scattered documents and the concerned faces of the people surrounding her. "I feel so strange," Camilla said quietly, her voice small and uncertain. "I was doing something important, but I can't remember what it was. Did I make a mistake? Did I embarrass myself somehow?" William's response showed the kind of compassion that made Charlotte proud of her father. "You didn't make any mistakes, Camilla. You were working very hard on important matters, but sometimes our minds get tired and need a break. That's completely normal and nothing to worry about." Dr. Thornfield stepped forward to conduct a brief assessment, checking Camilla's awareness and cognitive function. While she had clearly returned to present-day reality, the episode had left her exhausted and emotionally fragile. As arrangements were made for Camilla to rest in her private apartments with around-the-clock supervision, Charlotte finally understood the full scope of what her family was facing. These episodes would likely become more frequent and severe, each one stealing away a little more of the grandmother she knew and loved. When Charlotte finally emerged from her hiding place, her father noticed her immediately. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest and difficult they had ever shared. William acknowledged that Charlotte had witnessed something that would be hard to forget, and they talked about how the disease was affecting not just Camilla but everyone who loved her. That evening, Charlotte sat with her parents and learned more about the family's long-term plans for supporting Camilla through her illness. They discussed how her role as a granddaughter might change, what kinds of activities might still be meaningful for them to share, and how to maintain emotional connection even when cognitive recognition became unreliable. Charlotte went to bed that night with a deeper understanding of love's complexity. She realized that loving someone with dementia meant learning to find joy in moments of connection while accepting the pain of moments of separation. It meant being brave enough to keep showing up even when the person you loved couldn't always remember who you were. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in the long gallery of Kensington Palace, her heart pounding as she heard her grandmother's voice echoing off the ancient walls. But this time was different from all the previous episodes she had witnessed. Camilla wasn't confused or lost in false memories. Instead, she was calling out with desperate clarity, her voice filled with a pain that cut through Charlotte like a knife. "Camilla, please stop." The words drifted down the corridor, and Charlotte realized with shock that her grandmother was talking to herself, using her own name as if she were pleading with the disease that was slowly taking her away. Charlotte had been returning from her afternoon writing lesson when she heard the commotion. Several members of the palace staff were moving quickly but quietly through the halls, their faces showing the kind of controlled concern that had become familiar during Camilla's more difficult days. As Charlotte approached the source of the disturbance, she saw Mrs. Whitmore standing outside the Queen's private sitting room, speaking quietly into her phone. Charlotte caught fragments of the conversation that made her stomach clench with worry. "Yes, she's been like this for about 20 minutes. No, this is different from her usual episodes. She seems to be having some kind of internal dialogue. We need someone here immediately." Through the partially open door, Charlotte could see her grandmother sitting in her favorite armchair, but her posture was unlike anything Charlotte had seen before. Camilla was leaning forward, her hands pressed against her temples, rocking slightly back and forth as she continued her heartbreaking monologue. "Please stop taking my memories," Camilla whispered to herself, her voice breaking with emotion. "I need to remember their faces. I need to remember their names. Please let me keep something of myself." Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her grandmother's desperate plea with the disease that was destroying her mind. This wasn't confusion or false memories. This was Camilla, completely aware and present, confronting the reality of what was happening to her with devastating clarity. "I used to know every flower in the palace gardens," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger but more anguished. "I could tell you the names of every staff member who has worked here for 20 years. I could remember every conversation with my grandchildren, every story they told me, every moment that mattered." Charlotte watched as Camilla's hands trembled, not from the physical effects of her condition, but from the emotional weight of understanding what she was losing. Her grandmother was having what Charlotte would later learn was called a moment of clarity, a brief period when the fog of dementia lifted enough for the person to fully comprehend their situation. "Camilla, please stop," her grandmother repeated, and Charlotte realized she was begging her own mind to halt its deterioration. "I'm not ready to forget them. I'm not ready to become a stranger to the people I love most in this world." The Royal Protection Officer stationed nearby noticed Charlotte's presence and gently tried to guide her away from the distressing scene. But Charlotte couldn't move. She was witnessing something incredibly private and important, a moment when her grandmother was fighting the disease with full awareness of what the battle meant. Camilla's monologue continued, revealing fears and concerns that she had never expressed to the family during her more confused states. She spoke about worrying that she would become a burden, that she would say something inappropriate at a public event that would embarrass